All right, so while we wait on other news and whatnot, this is what happens during the summer, where I go through books and all this wonderful stuff that I got sitting on my bookshelf, and we discuss things that happened in the past, sometimes distant past. To me, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago. Yeah, it does. It really does. The 80-81 season, when the Kings were dressed thusly. And it's the second year of the balanced schedule. It's the end of the balanced schedule. They did this for WHA teams that came in, and it was very unpopular with basically everybody. So the NHL wants to have rivalries, and that's how they schedule things, and that's how the playoffs work going forward. Let me know if you've heard this before, or even very, very recently. And that's when we go to the divisional battles in the first and second round. And then, of course, the semifinal and the final are different because you're in playing teams from the other divisions. And it's an interesting season in that the LA Kings finished fourth in the entire National Hockey League, just behind Montreal with 99 points. And then Jerry Buss, the owner, offers Coach Bob Berry a 1-year extension. To which Berry says, well, that's not any kind of job security. So he goes to Montreal to coach Montreal. And the Kings fell to 63 points a year later. So the LA Kings are in the midst of making really bad decisions that will continue for a lot of the 80s. Boston gets swept by 3. They're swept in 3 by the North Stars in the first round. This is when it was best 3 out of 5. And they were relying too much on their defense for goals. So the Minnesota North Stars able to stop those defensemen from getting goals. There wasn't enough up front. I mentioned yesterday they were getting older, and that's the case. And they were going to need a youth movement. And here we go, right? The Nordiques, Peter Stastny's Rookie of the Year. His brother Anton was pretty darn good as well. Marion would come over a year later. The story of how the Stastnys defected is a harrowing tale where basically kind of feels like they're taking their lives in their own hands to duck out like a thief in the night. This is when young players weren't being allowed to defect. They were just allowing the older guys at the end of their careers could defect. And the Soviets aren't even thinking about those guys being allowed to defect at this point in the game. The Montreal Canadiens had always hoped that Vladislav Tretiak would make his way over and play for them at some point. And I got to admit, as a young hockey fan, I thought that would have been amazing. But what I did was too young to understand was the Soviets weren't going to let him go. If he even had a whole lot of desire to come over and play here. The Flyers. In the second round, they'd lost defensemen Jimmy Watson and Bob Daly, 2 of their better defensemen. And in the playoffs, they also had Rick St. Croix as their starter, as Pete Peters was out with injury. What this shows is that the Flyers are also a team that's in need of a change, and there's going to be a changing of the guard for the Flyers. The players that they still have from their Stanley Cup days are going to be moving on, retiring pretty quick. The Oilers, they sweep the Habs in round 1. So Montreal comes in, number 3 in the entire league. The Oilers are nowhere near that, but in the playoffs, they sweep them. They lose in round 2, but they do sweep the Montreal Canadiens in round 1. They scored 328 goals, which is impressive, but they allowed 327. Fire wagon hockey is here. And Gretzky had 164 points to set a brand new league record. Oh hum. Greg Millen played 63 games for the Penguins. He outplayed Liut in the first round, but he was also the lowest paid goaltender in the league as the Penguins continued to cheap out on him. So he decides to go free agent. He does, and he ends up signing with the Hartford Whalers. The Penguins are being mismanaged badly at this stage. And there are a lot of teams being mismanaged, and part of it may very well be 16 out of 21 teams are making the playoffs. So you can mismanage a team and still make the playoffs. And that playoff appearance can give fans the idea that there's still hope, where in a lot of cases, there really isn't. So yeah, they lose in the first round, and then they lose their starting goalie and Greg Mellon. The Capitals, they had added Mike Palmateer to their net, and they also had Stevenson in net, Wayne Stevenson. The idea that these two veterans would come in, solidify things, and finally get the Capitals into the playoffs, and no is the answer. Mike Palmateer is actually given some of the blame for the Capitals missing the playoffs that year. They barely missed. They miss on that last night of the season, losing out to Toronto. So the honor of getting destroyed in the first round went to the Leafs rather than the Capitals. The Calgary Flames, their first year in Calgary, they make it to the semifinals. The organization had been seen as a choker in the playoffs while in Atlanta, in Calgary, while playing to the smallest crowds in the league at the Corral, which was not an NHL level arena by any stretch. They shed that whole choker reputation. So, good run for Calgary along the way. Vancouver. So, the Flying V, which we all know is like one of the ugliest jerseys in NHL history. It's a joke. It was designed by a psychologist. Yep. And all I can think is, not a very good one. But a psychologist with the idea that it'll be intimidating. That the colors and the style and just teams will see that coming at them. And no. Unless belly laughs are going to make a team play poorly, it's not intimidating. Not at all. So yeah, the Vancouver Canucks are mired in mediocrity. And the following season they'll go on a run, but not in the regular season, just playoffs. Well, we'll get to that tomorrow. St. Louis, they had 107 points, good for second in the National Hockey League. Only 3 points back of the Islanders, who finished first overall and, of course, won their second straight Stanley Cup. I discussed that in last year's history video. That's why it's not on the board today. But in the second round, the New York Rangers exposed St. Louis has a weak blue line. So with constant forechecking, that blue line wears down, and they lost in, I believe it was a 6-game series. So I thought that was interesting enough to throw up there, because here's St. Louis, who finished very high during the regular season, and they lose in the playoffs because their defense gets worn down by a bigger, stronger team. Which is kind of the opposite to what happened in the 2019 playoffs, where St. Louis comes in and they upset a couple of teams in those playoffs. I think there was 3 in total that were upsets. Now, the North Stars went to the final this year, and they were road warriors. They beat Boston, they beat Buffalo, and they beat Calgary in order to get to the Stanley Cup Finals. Tremendous run for the North Stars. And it led people to say, these guys are going to win a cup. And I remember thinking that myself. This was the year where an 8-year-old Shannon jumped on the bandwagon and decided to be a North Stars fan. And he's still a North Stars/Stars fan to this day. But yeah, after beating Boston, Buffalo, and Calgary, it looked like they were moving up. The reality hit them in the finals when the Islanders destroyed them. But there was still a belief that this Minnesota team, this young upstart team, would be able to win a championship. And they didn't. Not with that roster. And not in Minnesota. Noteworthy out of Chicago. Tony Esposito, or just Espo, as he was called at the time, spelled thusly, plays 66 games for Chicago at the age of 37. So while most goalies, especially back then, they're winding things down, not Esposito. And he's still being heroic on many, many nights. This is a Blackhawks team which is nowhere near as good as they got when they won cups in the early 2010s. No, this is a team that's got its warts and its weaknesses, shall we say, and he is fantastic for them. So Esposito, still a warrior. The Leafs are noteworthy. The Leafs are always noteworthy. They fired Joe Crozier, so they end up going with their third coach in 3 years. And they get swept as the number 16 rated team. They make the playoffs because the Capitals lose on the last night of the year. To which Leaf fans go, yes, we made it. We're playing the Islanders. We're dead. And that was basically it. So if I'd made a video back then, it would have been the Leafs are dead. And I would have been right. Michel Larocque is added from the Montreal Canadiens. This is when Larocque is PO'd at Montreal. And Montreal goes, oh, we don't want Michel anymore. So they trade him to Toronto. And then they fudge things around with which goalies have played games. So when the Vezina Trophy gets awarded for lowest goals against, Larocque may have his name on there, but there's other goalies on there as well to try to diminish his role. This is when we change the Vezina Trophy. This is why we can't have nice things. But Larocque, while he looked good, he has a horrible loss to the Sabres, and it's just way downhill for him after that. He ends up finishing with a 5.27 goals against for the Leafs. He is not going to be in the league much longer. So Michel Larocque, or Bunny as he was called, that was his nickname. He has a rough start with the Leafs, and it ends up signaling that his career is winding down. And all because he believed he should be the starter in Montreal. He was mad about not being the starter. Detroit, they're 20th out of 21st, and the only thing I can put on the board about the Red Wings is they finished ahead of Winnipeg because Winnipeg was so absolutely brutal. The one thing that Winnipeg's got going for them is the general manager, John Ferguson, says this is the last time we'll be picking first. And he's right. That organization didn't pick first again. I did the video yesterday on the Arizona/Winnipeg franchise, the original Jets. They never picked first again. So he's right, and that was 38 years ago. So that's some fantastic go buy yourself a lottery ticket type talk. Detroit, however, they didn't have their number 2 draft pick. They had traded it. So Detroit doesn't have a lot on the way either. Detroit is just so badly mismanaged. And it goes back to the 70s on how badly managed the Detroit Red Wings were. It's amazing that they became what they did in the 90s and the 2000s, considering how bad this team was in the 80s. And I thought this was noteworthy, and I should end it here. 5 teams missed the playoffs. The Capitals, Hartford, who are now Carolina, Colorado, who are now New Jersey, Detroit, and Winnipeg, who are now Arizona. So of the 5 teams that missed the playoffs, 3 of them would end up moving. And that's how attendance works. If you build it, they will come. And if part of that is if you win, they will come. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting note from the 80-81 season. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And again, just a fun thing to look back on. Because a lot of these kind of news items from years and years gone by, they get glossed over. All people remember from that season is, oh, the Islanders won their second cup, and Gretzky was a big, huge scoring hero, and a lot of the other stuff kind of gets forgotten. So that's what this series is about. Thank you guys so much for all your support. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And I'll talk to you again soon.